Hi everyone. I hope you've had a great weekend and a great week one as well. It's certainly been a pretty cruisy start to the term, which is good. It's been really nice to talk to a lot of students, get to know some people, particularly some of the late introductions. There's a couple of newcomers to the course. Hello, if you've enrolled late into the course. We accept enrollments in this course up until the Friday of week 2. And if you have enrolled late, that's okay. We try and set up 6080 in a way that it's pretty gentle to people who enroll a week late. There's nothing absolutely destructive about it. I have got a new YouTube comment item here. I can select comments from various people, so it's not automatic just before you post something stupid. This is Andy. Everyone say hi to Andy. If you haven't already, just, reach out to Andy somehow and be a nice person. Today we have a live lecture consisting of two key components. This first part, which is essentially a demonstration of just some basic HTML, CSS web page building, and then a second part which is focused on just a little bit of an intro to assignment 1, which should be a relatively straightforward task to do. Before we get into that, I just had a couple of quick housekeeping points. The first housekeeping point would just be that I've seen a few people with questions over the last week, some very minor questions, and what I remembered is that we actually have from the previous term, it was one of the things that I forgot to migrate. Where is it? Let me get this in. It was one of the things I forgot to migrate, but we actually have, from a previous term, a FAQ page, which I will go and put on Eccles. So there's actually this FAQ.md. I'm going to go and put some of this information up on Eccles, particularly these last 3 points. So what I mean by that is that sometime tonight or tomorrow, if you go to the Resources tab here on our course website, you will be able to see some extra information about CSS here. I'll probably just put it here, and that's these 3 questions, which is people saying, how do I make my viewport a specific size? We kind of covered that in other lectures. There's this little icon over here where you can do that. But probably 2 more interesting questions that I've seen come up on the forum is, 1, why is there a white border around my web page? Because if you've tried this out, if you go and make a really simple website like we're going to do today, and you just create a div that's, say, 100% width, 100% height, and its background is red, what happens with this div is that it doesn't seem to occupy the entire screen. So if I open that up in the browser, it does that, and you got this little, I think it's 8 pixels, I can't remember. Maybe I got that wrong, but I think it's 8 pixels. You can get rid of that just by adding a body margin of 0, which we probably do today. And then the second question that's very common is this one about sometimes if you're using the responsive web viewer, what ends up happening is that when you try and resize it and things, the zoom doesn't seem to behave. And there's a little bit of a weird tag that you can actually add to the top of your HTML page. It's a meta tag that helps with that scaling. I'm not going to go into it now, but there's an explanation about why it works here. So if you're using like the browser, the mobile window thing, and you're like zooming in, but stuff isn't working, and if it just feels like something's wrong, go have a look at that. You can actually access this publicly on this URL. It is public, so you could type that in right now if you wanted, but I'll go and put it on the resources page tonight. I have like 7 hours of meetings at work on Monday, and then I have a lecture, so I spend a lot of the evening just catching up on stuff. So this will be one of those things I do. Anyway, that's the background. I think that's the main piece of housekeeping. Just a quick reminder to all people, particularly those again who've enrolled late. As always, this week, please go. You're obviously in this lecture right now. You can go into your tutorials this week. You can go to any tutorials, remember. This week, we have Aditi, Edwina, Clarence, Anushka, Nikhil, and Jason doing the tutorials. So we kind of rotate between each other this term. So I don't do any this week. Clarence does the time I do. And more help sessions are starting up this week too. Not a crazy amount because we're kind of aware that most of the students who start the assignment now, I encourage you all to. You all should, but I'm a realist. I know a lot of you won't. Mostly we just don't need that support, whereas next week we have quite a lot of support. My advice to all of you, and I laid this out in the notice on Friday again, I laid it out clearly and was like, this is when I think you should do stuff. I just want to remind you that that's coming from what I consider myself to be a relatively lazy student. So I'm just trying to give you friendly advice there, if that helps. Last thing is that remember that after tutorials, usually about a day or two later, usually by Thursday afternoon, I go and slice up the tutorials and put them on YouTube. So for instance, this was the CSS replicator simple layout question. And this one was done by Sean, and I've gone and snipped that up into a 14-minute video. So if you'd like to go and like review a particular question or learn something, you can go and watch that later. Anyway, I think that's enough. I think that's everything. Yeah, I think that's everything. So let's start getting into the point. Oh, actually, no, there was one last thing, which is that a lot of the lectures this term will probably not run for 2 hours, or at least I will try not to. The reason for that is because the number of lectures you have to watch per week is not quite 4 hours. It's kind of sometimes a little bit less or sometimes a little bit more. And my aim is to give you like 36 hours across the term. So some weeks will be a little bit shorter just because, we don't want you doing kind of more watching than we expect you to across the term. The first few weeks are usually a little bit heavier on the theory. So speaking of theory, what we're up to today is right now we're going to be doing this demo HTML CSS page live, and then afterwards we'll do a quick assignment 1 overview. Now, there's no video here yet. The demo today is not meant to be, there's not really any slides, but what I actually did, and some of you would have seen this, is I thought I linked here, but let's open it up. Some of you might have seen this, but I actually went and asked a question about what sites would you like to go through today. Now, many of you had lots and lots of ideas, and obviously we're going to barely be able to go through many of them. One thing I'm going to click through a couple with you now. One thing is I am going to avoid any sites that are single page apps, and that's basically sites that are built with like really modern technology, which is probably most of these. Like we talked about Tesla, I think in my tutorial class last week, but Tesla site is quite an intricate website, and that doesn't mean that we can't do it. It's more like, ideally, just because I respect your time and don't want to fill you with lectures for the week, wanted to keep it relatively simple. So I'm just going to click on a few of these and we'll make a quick decision. We'll probably get through one or two. And I looked through all these before, but you can kind of see a lot of them are quite good. Intuit, I think I lodged my taxes with this company once. This website looks okay. This could be fun to do. Same with this one. This one has some cool animation. Oh my god, look at that. Whoosh. Slides.com, that's actually a very complex site. A lot of websites nowadays might be games or particular web apps. Like, it's pretty crazy that we have websites like Google Presentation and Docs and this Slides.com site, Canva, that are all just like remarkably powerful tools. Might just click on a couple more. Adam suggested any sporting websites. I don't really go on sporting websites, which is, oh my god. So when we look at websites like this, Ultimate Ears, you can see that they've got some extremely intricate stuff, and there's lots of different ways they could be implementing this, but that's kind of beyond the scope of what we're really looking at now. But a lot of it is a lot of CSS animation and JavaScript to really get things going. Netflix site's good. I don't have a login right now, so I can't really do Netflix. Unless they have they probably have like a landing page, right? That wouldn't be terrible. A little underwhelming. Maybe it's simple enough for us. And then last few things, I'll just have a look here. Oh my god. Okay. Interesting website. This looks like a whole bunch of colors. As you can see there, that's actually text, which is quite interesting. I had a couple of questions in the forum as well. People saying like, do I need to know JavaScript and stuff? And I think what's really important again is that you only kind of need to know what we point out to you. So for instance, this week, in week 1, there was all just HTML, CSS. And in fact, this week too, most of the week from today and then some of the pre-records, you're only really interested in more CSS and stuff. It's only in the last few lectures this week that we start pushing you down the direction of dealing with JavaScript and other stuff like that. Joseph's asked a question, does a Flexbox have a default width and height when it is initialized without specifying? Typically Flexbox structures occupy the whole space. If you're talking about Flex elements and not a container, like a Flex container will take up whatever space the element was already taken up before. And I just want to point out, Joseph's question, for instance, relates to this Flexbox lecture, and I just want to be really clear. So lectures today assume you've seen the stuff beforehand. So anyone watching today, I'm going to assume you've watched these, all of them, but I'm not going to assume you've watched any of these lectures, for instance. Okay. So let's get into it. I kind of like the really boring tax website. And what I want to do is I haven't pre-prepared this or anything. I really want to show you how some elements of this might get tackled. I'm just trying to see some things like this. Yeah, this looks like a nice little section, right? So how would we tackle a section like this on a website where we've got, title and text and all these boxes? And I might start off with just like a normal fixed size, for instance. So even though I make it smaller, I might zoom out a little bit just so we can kind of see everything at the same time. And I might also make this smaller. This is obviously one of the challenges of web dev. In fact, I have quite a lot of screens here at home. Quite a lot of screens. And I mainly only use them for web dev a lot of the time. Otherwise, it's pretty relaxed. So Reese has asked a good question. Will I be handling any resizing today? Maybe we'll touch on it a little bit. As I said, I'm not going to assume anyone's watched the mobile CSS lecture because it's kind of the next thing. And reality is, again, we're trying to cater this for people who are really struggling to even get started. But we will touch on it a little bit for sure. So if I'm trying to build something, whether it's something I see on screen or whether it's a design I've seen or whether it's something in my head or something I've drawn on paper, usually the best place to start is to just try and scaffold things out at a really, really high level. And what that means is get the core text down, get the core information down, and then kind of come back and stylize it. So I'm just going to write down a couple of tips here. So first one is, don't work from top to bottom. Work from, abstract to detailed, you might say. So that's number one. The second thing I'm going to add is use inline styles whilst you're hacking. So as you've seen in the previous lecture last week, of course, you can come along and create your style at the top of a web page like this that will house all your CSS, and you can go use classes and IDs and all that stuff's really great. Though the problem is that it just takes more time to go and modify the class and then go and manipulate this. And let's also be honest, most of the time you're building pages at the moment, you're not dealing with a ton of repetition. So if I was building this page here in some of these images, I would go and probably make a class for the 3 boxes because it's being repeated, right? So the benefit of using classes or IDs in a style bracket as opposed to inline styles is that A, it's cleaner, and B, you're avoiding repetition because HTML does not really have any inbuilt way to kind of store a notion of a variable or a template. So I'm going to kind of leave this blank to start, and then I'm going to go make my simple HTML page. Remember, browsers are really, really smart. They won't need any of this information. If you don't put it in, they'll leave it out, but I'll put it into it like that. And then we have our body. Now, I've been a big fan of 2-space indenting, though this doesn't really matter. You do what you want, though I've become a big fan of it because, it helps with nested pages like this a lot. So, again, all programming advice, this applies beyond HTML, is do as little as possible before you refresh the page. I don't really need to. You're all smart enough people. And what I mean by that is before I even go and figure stuff out, I'm like, all right, hello, I've got that. I'm going to go, in this case, make a box to kind of like capture the page, because this is like, this isn't really part of the web page, but this is kind of what you do for your assignment. You know how in your assignment we say things like, for question 1 and 2, the boxes, and I know many of you haven't looked at it, but for those who have, or this will make sense later, we say things like the box is 1600 pixels by 1200 pixels. And sometimes something you can do to help frame that up is say, well, I've got a box here, a div, that has a height of 1600, sorry, a width of 1600 and a height of 1200, and it's got a 1 pixel border that's pretty dark. And I'm going to put hello in that. Okay. Now, is this 8 pixel margin annoying? Well, maybe, but I'm just trying to design in this box at the moment, so it's okay. Reese is asking a question which we might come back to, which is, speaking of which, if I have like 20 or 30 classes with not much in them for, say, task 2, will I lose much marks? No, I don't think so. Like, essentially, you should ideally have all of your CSS defined away from your HTML. That's kind of like the classical best way to do things, because now you've separated your structure and your aesthetics. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start essentially copying in this text. So what I'm going to do is put this here. Now I can tell this is a very big header, so I'm just going to put this in as H1 for the biggest header that exists. Now I've got my 3 boxes. Well, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use a class, and I'll call this blue box, because I can. And I will put another div there. I will come up the top. I might go and move this right up the top, and I will say, well, I've got blue box, which is going to be background. I don't know what color blue that is. The blue built into the browser is not going to be great. And when I look at the width of it, I can probably I can use Photopia. I don't actually know how to pronounce it. Photopia. Something. I can go and use that to find the specific example, a specific width. But here we'll just assume that it looks like it's about 250 to 300 pixels if I don't zoom in, and then I'll give it some random height of, that looks like about, I don't know, 100 and... Oh, that's quite... No, I think I've underestimated that. Not that it matters. You can just go and tweak it. I'll give that a height of something like 150 pixels, and there's my blue box, and then I'm going to refresh my page, and I have a little box here. You can see the blue's off. We'll go and fix that up later. Now, StarX has posted a great comment about VS Code Live Server. So if you use VS Code for your programming, particularly for web stuff, VS Code, I don't know if it's built in or if it's an add-on, but it has this thing called Live Server, where what it will do is it's essentially got a file system watcher that keeps an eye on all the files you have in your code, and if it notices that you save some, it will refresh the browser for you. I think that's the gist of it. That's a great plugin. If you don't use VS Code or use something from JetBrains or whatever else, you can actually find most browsers like Chrome, Firefox and stuff have add-ons where you can actually get something that will automatically refresh your page every second or something. They're really great tools too. You can refresh it manually. The only thing to point out to people is that if you use VS Code Live Server, you have to be very careful because it actually screws up a few things in assignment 2. So just remember that. If you're ever having like this, you're like, oh, why is my assignment 2 not working? Turn off VS Code Live Server. This is assignment 2, number 2, not 1. This is in like 2 or 3 weeks, but keep that in mind. So I've got my blue box there. Now, because it's a class, I'm going to go and copy and paste it a few times like this. And I've got this different stuff in each box. So what I'll do is I'll go and like write that in. I might make this one, an H2 or something. And I'll write 16, and then I'll just put a random div in here called development sites. And then I'll go and copy and paste that, and copy and paste that. And then I'll just go and update the text. I tried to pick an example too that was fairly... how would you say, like, not a lot of text. I didn't want to spend all day copying. So now we've got 3 things like this. Now, first thing you can see is like, oh, Lord, the colors are wrong. Well, I can pretty quickly, I might make this one even smaller because I don't think we need all that space. I can very quickly tackle this by just going and I might expand this. I'm going to leave my CSS in a single line here because we don't have a lot of screen space, but normally I would, if it's more than a line, I'd usually break it up like this. Okay, that's kind of how you should probably write CSS. It's very digestible to people that way. There's no particular order things have to be in, at least nothing I've ever heard about. But what I'm going to do here is I want to say everything inside a blue box is white, so I might just say color white. Now I'm in the habit of using hex codes, just for some reason. You don't have to, of course, but if you do the shorthand three character hex code, it essentially is shorthand for the 6 character hex code, and we get something like that. Now, also, you'll immediately notice that the default font on browsers is Times New Roman. It's a serif font. I can't remember. I think this is in the font lecture. A serif font. Yeah, it's a serif font, not a sans serif font, which makes it great for reading, but not great for titles and stuff. The internet's generally moved away from serif fonts. It's kind of very old school now. Like, the idea was that serif fonts, I don't really know the psychology behind it, but it was meant to be easier to read large sets of text. I think last time this came up in the previous term, I gave an example how I think a lot of some New York Times sites still use them sometimes for like big swaths of text. I mean, I think a lot of websites use them, but they're much less common now, which is also why they look weird. Like, you look at that and you think, oh, that page looks ugly. I'm sure some of you do. And what your brain is actually doing is you are noticing that it's old. It looks old. And that's because I'm going to go give the body tag a style for the Arial font family. And now it just looks like a little bit better. It's kind of funny how these serif fonts, particularly Times New Roman, kind of give us a sense of the old internet. Mitchell says, are we ever going to cover CSS naming conventions like BEM? That's a good question. It's one of those things that I think slipped through the course in terms of it being a big deal, because I think like a lot of things in programming, there are just always naming conventions, and kind of where you go, what you do will dictate it. Though I think probably something that is worth flagging with people generally is that usually when you are describing things with IDs or classes in HTML, CSS, I would generally recommend that you don't do what I've done here and call it blue box, but obviously call it box blue. Essentially, if you just follow a principle of you start from the broadest sense of what something is, and then you get more specific in. It makes it easier, because then you can group boxes by box blue and box green, and if you have big box and small box, you can call them box big blue, box small green, right? It becomes an easier way to group things. So I might just change that up. I'll quickly replace these. Box blue. So I've got my boxes here now. One problem, of course, is that they aren't really aligned properly on the page. I might even have to drag this browser down a tiny bit so you can see it. They aren't really like super aligned on the page. Now, you can solve this a whole bunch of different ways. If this was like early 2000s, you'd solve this by putting them in a table, like literally an HTML table. More common ways of solving them then became to use the position relative and absolute. That was a little bit chaotic, I think. Or more often than not, like a really common way this used to get solved was using a float, was actually putting a float property on this element. This was covered in the layouts lecture, and the float property would cause everything to float up like that. And then you would add margins to them. For instance, you'd say like, oh, we'll give everything a margin of 10 pixels, and the browser would go and sort it out. The problem with floats was, actually I'm wondering, oh, that box is huge. So let me make the page box a bit smaller. Yeah, we'll leave it like something like that. So floats behaved okay-ish, like that, they would, oh, well, that box is, I'm just going to make this 100% of the page. The problem here, right, is that because this box is 900 pixels, even when the window gets smaller, the browser will still hold that amount of space. But, floats were okay, like they kind of rolled things around a bit. But the main problem with floats was that they didn't really do great with, they weren't very scalable. So again, if before Flexbox, you might do something like this, but then you say, well, the boxes look super weird, and you'll learn more about what I'm about to show you in the mobile CSS lecture probably. But you can say, I want to start doing things in percentages, because when it comes to sizing and layout, there's two kind of big pieces of two directions. You can either go the absolute route like we've done here, or you can go the percentage route and say, I want it to occupy a third of the screen. Now, percentage stuff gets really complicated because I said I wanted to occupy a third of this. I wanted to occupy a third of the element, but it's not behaving like that here. In fact, when I say a third, it's the third between these two black lines. So similarly, if I make this if I make my outer box like 500 pixels, they'll be quite small, right? Try and occupy a third of that. But the problem is what's actually happening is the size of this box is a third of the space between the two black lines, which doesn't account for the margins and stuff. So I kind of have to get rid of the margins to like fit everything in. Do you know what I mean? Because it's like they're all going to occupy a third. I'm not 100% sure what that extra bit of space on the side is, to be honest. That kind of surprised me. Oh, it's because it's 33%. My bad. I don't know. Now it's probably going to fill it. Yeah, so now it fills it completely. So that's like, oh, margins, 10 pixels. Now it's not filling it. How do you solve this old school? Well, usually what you used to do is you used to use the CSS calc expression. And the calc will actually let you do some really simple math that the browser's capable of figuring out within the CSS engine. Where you'd say, you know what, the width is actually a third, but minus 20 pixels because we've got 10 pixels of margin on either side. And now you have something like that. And even this looks a bit weird because your margins like here, see how the margins are 10 pixels on each side, but in the middle, because there's two margins, they're kind of buffering up against each other. And that creates a problem. So then you think, God, how do I solve that? Well, how you used to, when I say how you used to, it's not like you can't now. It was more like, Flex helps you get around some of these problems. But I'm just giving you a quick... I mean, today there's no aim besides exploring stuff together and answering questions, right? I don't have anywhere I'm intending for this to go. But sometimes you might have put a 10 pixel margin. You might put a box around all the elements and then put a 10 pixel margin on that box. And what that 10 pixel margin on that box would do is it would kind of give that extra 10 pixels to all the sides so that they look a little bit like that. And you can see that didn't actually screw up the sizing because now the blue boxes are doing this width calculation within a smaller box. So it's 33% of a smaller box, and that's why that happened. Now, this isn't terrible. You know, this kind of approach is fine. And if I make this page back to 100%, you can get kind of this nice effect here where, you know, the boxes do get smaller. And then, in fact, you can give the boxes a minimum width. And this is a common thing you'll do is you'll give a width in conjunction with a minimum width. And even sometimes a maximum width, too. So I can say, well, I want my kind of general width to be 33%. But you know what? If they get smaller than 150 pixels, that's, you know, 100 pixels, that's getting pretty small. Maybe can we just leave them that size? So as I scale this down now, browser won't actually get any smaller than that. Browsers can only go so small. I could do this in DevTools, but I don't want to rely on DevTools today because it's the next lecture. You can see here they'll grow, but as they get down to 200 pixels, they'll stop. And then they'll start overflowing, right? So it's very declarative in that sense. The browser is like reading your rules and essentially rendering it how it can. You can also apply a max width too. So if you think, you know what, a max width should be maybe 400 pixels. Now as they get bigger, they'll only get so big until they do that. Then you think, that's cool, but when I get my page really big, I really want them to sit in the middle. How do you solve that problem? Well, like a lot of HTML, CSS stuff, there are a kind of common techniques used to solve problems. The one I did before with the like wrapping box that had a 10 pixel margin is something you'll do a lot. You'll often find these like wrapping boxes. You'll wrap something in something else. To get something centered, the two approaches are often either to, if it's one element, you can give it an auto margin on either side, and I'll give you an example with this. Let's say that I take my H1 now, so I'm jumping over to my H1 element here, this header up the top. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, you know what, it's going to have a width of 500 pixels, which means it's going to shrink down because the box now is like smaller, right? It used to just be however long it needed to be. And as Mitchell said, might move my comment selector over here. Yeah, so as Mitchell said here, what we can do is we can actually say, well, my H1, actually I'll make the background red so you can see it. This is the H1's background, right? If I give the element, which is a block element, a margin left of auto and a margin right of auto, what the auto means is kind of like balance filling it. And if you kind of, you know, it's kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of like if you were to shoot water cannons out of your arms on both sides, you'd kind of center align yourself somewhere because the two forces are pushing on each other equally. And what you get is you get an effect like this, right? Now you can do this another way too. If I go and copy and paste this one, let me just go and copy and paste this. Instead of doing that, what I can actually do is get rid of all these styles, but instead I can just say, well, I just like to align the text to the center. And now we get that. Now what's the difference between these two things? Background is red. Well, the difference is in the text align center, the actual element itself was taking up the entirety of the row, like it is here. But when we did the other method, it was taking up less of the row, which may or may not be beneficial depending on what you're doing. But we had the problem where the text itself wasn't actually center aligned. But, you know, we could get around that too just by center aligning the text. So if I come uncomment this one back out and I refresh the page, I could also just add another text align as center. And this is just an example of how you can kind of play around with these things. And, you know, the text align centers what centers the text, but the margin's what actually centers the block. Margin auto is something you're going to think about a lot, but just to be really clear, it doesn't work with span objects, okay? So if I go and make a span like this, I say span hello. A common thing I'll see students do is they'll make a span and they'll say, cool, I'm going to go and center it, right? And they'll try this. They'll say text align as center. That won't do anything. And the reason it won't do anything is because it is an inline element. Inline elements only occupy the width needed to contain the item. So that's a span, and notice the difference with a div, even though they'll do the same thing, right? A div will occupy the whole space, a span will only occupy what it needs. So what they'll do is they'll go and try that text align center thing, but it won't do anything. So then they'll come along and they'll say, well, what else did I learn in lectures? And they'll come in and they'll start doing, you know, margin left auto, margin right auto, which again won't do anything because it's not a block element. Spans can't have like a sense of a margin like that. So to be honest, a lot of the time, the only times you really use span is for freeform text. Otherwise, it's usually easier just to work with open it, like, you know, block elements. But back to this page, because that was like a little bit of a tangent. If I go and have my H1 element here still, I'll go back and keep focusing on my boxes. A comment that Roger said was, can we use flex layout here? We can. I achieved most of what you wanted to do with dynamic layouts without flex. So the benefit that flex would provide here is less to do with capability and more to do with simplicity. Because in a lot of ways, this is very like ugly and hacky. So what I might instead do is I might actually go and say, well, I've got my flex items here. Because when you think of flex, you really have to think in terms of I've got my flex items and my flex container. There's one container for many items. And what you do is for the flex container, you say display flex. And then for the flex items, sometimes I'll just try and, you know, I'm going to comment some of these things out because like I'm going to share that this code will go up with the repo and stuff. Like it'll go up so you can access it. The folder will be renamed something else though. It'll be named 22T1 HTML CSS demo, not this. So yeah, I've got my box blue. Well, I'm going to keep the background blue, and I'll keep the height at 150, and I'll keep the color as FFF. But all this stuff I did to manipulate it, I'm just going to use flex 1 here. And I'll try and refresh that page. Now, this is looking a little bit, you know, that was a lot easier than the float left and the width stuff, because flex will by default occupy, you know, an even amount of space if it can. But I do want to give it a gap, and then I think, oh, literally I've forgotten how to do that. So I'll Google, you know, flex gap, and you know, I think it's on the container. Where is it? Gap. What's it called? Gap 12. Okay. Yeah. So gap is kind of like, watch this. If I go now, okay. So the container. Sorry, this is the container here. I'll say gap should be 10 pixels. Now what's powerful about flex is that on the previous example we were defining margins of a particular box, whereas this one we're actually giving it to the container, so that's container's job to put that 10 pixels between. And this is nice and clear because now you don't have to like create a 10 pixel margin by saying you don't create a 10 pixel gap by creating two 5 pixel margins. It's just easier to articulate that it has a gap of 10 pixels. And in fact, if we want to give the whole thing another margin of 10 pixels, we just say 10 pixels and it will put a margin around it all. So that part's a lot simpler. Flex obviously has a whole bunch of properties built into it about minimum width and size and stuff. I don't really keep that off the top of my head, and to be honest with you, a lot of the time I will just go and I'll usually try it out just with minimum width because, you know, I'm somewhat lazy. I'll be like, yeah, minimum width 200 pixels like this, and I'll see if that works. And sometimes it works, sometimes I don't expect how it behaves, and I'm like, oh, that's weird. So you just pushed it off the screen there, just like overflowed it, we'd call it. And, you know, part of the reason for that's because we don't have flex wrap enabled. So flex wrap is a property of flex that will dictates how components actually wrap around. And you can see there that the two types are no wrap or wrap reverse. So by default, it's no wrap, which means that if things overflow, there's no wrapping. But what I want to do is make it wrap. So what wrapping does is that if the element hits the edge of the screen, it will fall down to the next row like that. Now you can see immediately the behavior of flex is actually a little bit different to how what we did with floats works. I kind of ran into this problem on the course site when I was making this page. I was kind of like, oh, this looks really nice, but then it got weird once I fell into a number that wasn't divisible by like 3 or 4, like that. I was like, you know, so it was like that big and then this big. This is all flex at work here, and it's all minimum widths. So I don't know what the minimum widths of these boxes are, but every time it hits it, they can't compress it anymore. So something falls over, like flows over. Bam, bam, and, you know, that's all fine. But yeah, the weird one is only that size. Now, I'm very lucky. I didn't intend for there to be 12 boxes here. I just put boxes there. So 12 is obviously a very good number because it's divisible by so many things. But you get the idea. Back to this page, it's like, okay, so this seems to work. You can probably put a minimum width on the flex element itself, for instance here. Like, if I never want this to expand so far, like, I never want it to expand like that, then we could change that around. Let's go and have a look at how this web page works. So what happens if I expand this? Okay, same size, and then it gets a bit smaller, and then eventually the website snaps. So it just totally changed here. How it totally changed is something that you can explore in the CSS mobile lecture if you haven't already. That's where we talk about breakpoints and media queries. That's a whole interesting topic, and you'll need that for task 3 of your first assignment. But here it's just kind of your simple sizing. So you can actually see they have a max size and a min size. So let's try and replicate that just like we did before. I'll say that the blue boxes should have a min width of 200 and say a max width of 300, maybe something like that. You know, that's cute, kind of does that. Now, how do you stop it? Now, a question you might ask is, how do I stop it wrapping at all? Like, how do I stop it, like, running off the screen or wrapping? And the answer to that is usually just define your parent element a bit clearer. And I talked before about the two widths approach. It's something you can apply all the time. So, for instance, my parent container that these flexes are wrapped in, I'll show you where it is because I can visualize these web pages, but watch what happens when I use yellow here. Oh, that was the wrong element, sorry. This one down here. You can see that it's just kind of wrapping those. So what I can actually do is not only, I mean, this one has an implied width of 100% because all divs have a default width of 100%. I could say that I want my min width to be 620 pixels or something like that. So that as this goes further down, that you can see now the website, as I shrink it, it actually just, you know, well, it's not the website in this case. It's actually, typically if you have a minimum width, you'd actually apply it to the parent. Most websites have a very small minimum width. I think 320 is generally considered a relatively, I'm going to shut the blinds. Everyone keeps looking in from the street whenever I lecture, so. I was like, it's like on the ground floor. just like look in and they're like, why is that guy in orange yelling at his screen? So, you know, I've got my minimum width of 620. A really common thing is you go to the very top element and decide what the smallest you want your page to be is, which might be 320, because without that width, your page will often just keep getting smaller and smaller. And there's a point where, like, even if you're on a mobile, I know it won't do it here, but if I open up the mobile view, which again you'll see in the CSS mobile lecture, there's a point you get to where you just think like the website should just not function when it's 150 pixels wide, right? It just shouldn't function. And in fact, in this case, it seems to have done relatively well at making itself bigger. I've probably got something in here I forgot about. Oh, I think the minimum widths of the blue boxes are helping. If I got rid of those, you'll see what will happen. It'll just literally compress it to nothing, maybe? No, there's something at play there. But yeah, the point is that typically you'll have a minimum size for the page. Now that doesn't really concern you much for the assignment. But yeah, I'm kind of digressing on a few tangents here. We want to get that white text to the right spot. So what I'm going to do is that instead of defining a class for that H2, I'm actually going to define the properties that I want all of the H2s within within my box blue to be. So I'll come down here and I'll say, you know what, box blue, and then this means immediate descendant, like this. So just to recap, you know, it's like I'll say here text align center or something, just so we can get an effect. We have something like this, right? And by the way, people, again, when you're seeing this thing pop open, I'm pressing F12. It's the developer console. That is covered more in lectures, both CSS mobile and CSS grids. It's like a helpful tool. It's like a debugger for a website, you know, a GDB for a website or something like that. GDB for a website just makes no sense, but it's better than nothing. So you can see I'm starting to apply those styles there. If I didn't have this arrow, it would be saying all of the H2s anywhere within box blue, sorry. But this just helps constrain it further so that down the line we don't accidentally have, because you see if I put an H2 here, it doesn't apply to that H2 because it's just the immediate descendant. Whereas if I get rid of this, then it is all of them. So it's a good little tip. Like if you're writing some HTML CSS that only needs to apply to the immediate descendant, then you use that little arrow. Now, I'll go and tidy this up to make it look how I want. 16, the font size is probably something bigger. I'm going to use 2EM. You can use pixels for the first assignment. I don't think we enforce anything about how to do sizings at all in this course, but EM's kind of what you're meant to use. I can also see those, how big do those boxes get again? Yeah, they get like relatively big. You'll also notice that that might even be a touch bigger. By the way, EM is kind of just like a scaled text, so 3EM means 3 times its normal size. And then I'll go and add in the text at the bottom. Now you can see that a lot of this isn't really like looking super clear. Now I would stress again that this stuff gets a lot easier if you go watch the DevTools lecture, because it shows you how to like analyze this page a little bit. And I can see here that this particular H2 element just seems like really big. So I'm going to go and add a green background to it just so I can see what it's doing. And I'm like, oh, okay. That's interesting. I don't know why it's taking up so much space here. I could go and look at it further, but typically when you see something like this, it's often a margin or padding. One thing I like to do when I'm not sure what's going on and I'm not feeling like I want to use all the tools is I'll just go and set the margin and padding of something to 0 and get a feel for what it is without it. And I'm like, okay. So that H2 element had a whole bunch of margin and padding built into it. Was it margin or padding? Let's try it out. Okay, it was margin. So maybe now I wanted to have a smaller margin at the top. Instead of 16, maybe just 5 pixels. That's a little bit small, so maybe 20 pixels. Then you think, all right, that looks okay. So I can go get rid of my green background. This is very, I wouldn't I wouldn't know what to say. You know, this is very kind of... It's like printf debugging. What I'm doing right now is the equivalent of that. So now I've got that, I'll go and clean up my text too. Usually it's a good idea if you say something like box blue div. I think it's generally good practice not to do this because div is such a general tag. I would probably give it a class name. You could say div.classname. I don't often see a lot of div.classname. Like if I was to say, say I call something descriptor text. You don't really need the div dot because div is such a common general element anyway. But what I will do here is I will go and class is like that. Also, as a general rule from the CSS lecture, you should try and ID things that aren't repeated. So if I go and say extract this and I call it I use it ID box blue container like that. Box blue container. Okay, and then I'll go and give this text another, text align center. Great, and I can kind of see, I can guess at this point that this H2 has a huge margin at the bottom, so I might get rid of that. Margin bottom 10 pixels. Okay, and then it's looking relatively close, and the font isn't perfect, but that's okay. Like I've said this in the forum and stuff before, font is really hard to get right because it's different on different devices, it's different on different computers. This particular font, I can go look this up with the things I've learned from the DevTools lecture. And I don't know, if I look down for the font, it's usually describes, oh my god, that's such a big freaking thing. Click too many buttons today. Yeah, if I come down here and I just look at the font, oh, that's awfully large. Filter. I've never actually used filter. Family. Okay, maybe it doesn't filter that. Oh, it's crossing everything out. I'm looking for what the actual font is. So define further up the top. Yeah, so it's this font called... So when you see fonts, there's a font lecture you can go and watch. It's a bonus lecture because we don't really think fonts are that critical. But here you can see that the main font is actually this font called Avenir Next. When you see many fonts, that's actually like a cascading failure thing. So it's like, go look for all these fonts, and if you can't find it, pick the next one. But this is definitely a custom font. The font is called Avenir Next for Intuit, and then the next one's called Avenir, and then Helvetica. And we can go and try those different fonts ourselves. So if I go and make this window smaller again, and I come back up the top, I had my body font was Arial. Let's try Avenir and see how it looks. I don't actually know if this is a system font. That's not a system font. I can tell, what I mean by that is that font is not installed on my computer, because fonts are actually running from your computer by default. And if they're not on your computer, browsers, thanks to new technology, can send them to your computer to be used in your browser. But if you're making a page by yourself, that font's just not going to exist without you doing some more coding. So that's why we're pretty relaxed about font, because, close enough is good enough. And Helvetica, yeah, that actually looks a little bit closer than Arial, right? I've lost everything. Where was I? I think that looks a little bit closer than Arial. Arial looked a bit... That's the same thing. I just got made by fonts. So we've got that there, and one of the last things is you can see that these boxes have rounded corners. That one's relatively straightforward. I could get my box blue. It's going to have a border radius of 5 pixels, right? Something like that. That looks around about right. If anything, to be honest, it looks a tiny bit small, but that kind of splitting is not something we get too concerned with, so 5 pixels, 6 pixels, at a glance, that looks fine. What would you get pinned at if this was part of the assignment? Well, a lot of this text here doesn't look super centered. You could solve this just by increasing the margin above the H2, which will shift everything down. It just wants to look a little bit more centered. Something like that is probably better. Whether I did 25 or 28 is probably not going to make a difference there, but that 20 was probably not close enough. And you can see it with your eyes too. You can see the font for the text underneath is a little bit smaller. So I'll say, font size, I'll make that one like 0.8 EM. Oops, I did that for the whole container. I did that for the wrong CSS element. So, that's like 0.8 EM. And again, that's even a bit too big. So I'll try 0.6 EM. that's too small, 0.7. You know, it's you're like, okay, that at a glance that looks fine. And I look at this and I think, you know what? Yeah, that's pretty good. I think the box is slightly too high. I might take a tiny bit of height off that. Obviously, like I'm guessing these quicker than you probably would. Taking that height off has kind of changed the center of the text a little bit. I don't think that matters too much. But you know, previously it was just like, because these are all absolute margins, it makes a difference. Great, and then the color's obviously wrong. I don't really know what that color is. I could quickly check. Again, you can check easily if this was a web page. If you went and used DevTools, which is in that other lecture. This is a very complex web page looking at it. There's a whole bunch of BS here that makes this really complicated, particularly reading so small. Oh, okay. Irfan, I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, sorry. I found the color hex code 053D6D. Okay, that looks good. And then I can get rid of this silly yellow wherever I put it, just for testing. Great. And then, like, that's the thing. All of a sudden now, we've just gone to that. That's close enough. Like, you know, the thing I always tell people is, like, your tutors are like you. I tell the tutors, you know, at a glance, can you tell that there's anything wrong with it? And it's like, that looks okay. I'm sure there's maybe one or two things that could be tweaked there. I think, honestly, the main thing that comes to my mind is the gap between the two pieces of text look a bit funny in terms of size. So I'd probably shrink those down just a tiny bit. But don't get caught up on things like, and I see students do this, like, oh, I can see that the E here is kind of aligned with the front of the T, you know, but I mean, to be honest, this is actually very well aligned, but fonts and stuff, just leave them alone. You can also see that this text looks a little bit different here. Usually you can get away with that, but one thing I'll point out is that if text ever looks slightly wrong, sometimes the text you see in one image is a little smaller and a little bolder. So let's just poke with that really quickly. If I say here, I'm going to go get my, you know, font size 1EM, which is the normal, well, that's the normal reading size, but your H1 tag is typically bigger than that. It's like overridden or something, to something like this. If I go and make this just a touch smaller and keep making it a touch smaller, maybe even a touch smaller, and then I go and put a bold font weight on it, like this, it looks like it was already bold. Oh, I think H1s are already bold. It was already bold. I was going to demonstrate to you how sometimes slightly smaller and bolder text looks a bit different, but I kind of just walked myself into a corner there. But it's another example of how fonts are really hard. And what that means is that, like, I can probably make this font slightly smaller so it looks a little less wacky, because it does look a little bit big, right? But it's going to be hard to get it much better than that, because it's just different fonts, frankly. And different fonts look different. This one looks a little thicker, but this is already thick. And that's because go watch the fonts lecture. That's why we pre-record lectures. Go watch the fonts lecture if you want to learn more about that. Yeah, it's a funny little insight from Mitchell. Yeah, so some people who've gone and watched lectures again, like select elements come up. You can go and learn more about a page by inspecting it. Go watch the DevTools lecture. That's pretty useful. Now, I know we haven't actually done a lot today. We've done a lot of talking and learning about little odds and ends. That's kind of the nature of web dev. And I just want to encourage you that that's okay. Like, you've probably started doing things like this, and you've probably gone, you know, this isn't particularly challenging, but it is darn frustrating. And yeah, it is a little bit. You know, it doesn't have the same. Again, you know, I think about on two ends of the spectrum, you have making some blue boxes, and on the other end of the spectrum, you have writing a merge sort. You know, and they're just two very different problems. One of them you're trying to deal with a whole breadth of knowledge, and the other one you're trying to deal with a very narrow but deep, complex base of knowledge. And that's okay. Don't beat yourself up. Don't get frustrated. You're just doing something different, right? It'd be like, you know, if you went and played sport and you were like, God, it's annoying having to stand up. It's like, well, you're playing sport, you know. This is a different sport to some of the other stuff you do. You will get better at it the more you do it. Don't expect yourself to kind of know everything off the top of your head. Google lots. There's lots of little examples, and feel free to like Google something specific, like boxes margin outside different to margin in between. Like try and generalize the problem. Mastering margin collapsing, you know, and I've never seen this. This looks interesting to me. But lots and lots of stuff you can do on Google. And then the last kind of advice I was going to give, which has kind of escaped me now, to be honest. I don't know. I'll remember it. But you can see how with this example, how we just kind of chipped away at it, right? We just got the boxes, got the vague color. Using background color is a great tool. I would recommend that you just make as many elements as you can have background colors, because it helps you really see stuff. Like, even if you learn the DevTools stuff, it's still a lot to conceptualize, whereas background colors can make things really, really great and easy. So yeah, we set out to make some websites, and we ended up making a few blue boxes. Great ambition. Jimmy says, it's okay, it's why we have CSS 3, because they found better alternatives twice, and there'll be CSS 4, there's going to be better. Yeah, so that's the cool thing about web, is that things are constantly advancing. So when I started programming, really quick story, we'll take a break soon. If I wanted to do something like this, used to have like a box shadow. You can do this now. You can create a container, a box shadow like that. Looks a bit weird, right? Because I put it on the wrong element. I should put it on the boxes, not the container. So let me go put it on the boxes. Previously, and this is a really interesting story, this was a CSS version 3 edition. What happened before CSS version 3 was that the only way to get a box like, I should really make this a chewed activity, to get a box like shadow, what you used to have to do is you'd have your box, and then you would actually go and create a whole bunch of small images. And one of those images was a bottom left corner. Another image was a bottom right corner. Another image was a top right corner, like this. And then you had two very narrow images like this one, which are so small I can't even highlight them. I don't know why I'm looking at that screen. You had two really small images like this, except it was only maybe 1 pixel high. And then another image like this that was only a pixel high. And if you wanted a box shadow, what you literally used to do is you would go and get a box like this, and you would actually break it up into a series of smaller boxes, where you would you'd go and say, well, this is my box, and then this is like the top right shadow, and then this is going to be the repeated image that way, and then this is the bottom right, and then this is going to be the repeated image this way, and then this is the bottom left. And then you would go and actually wrap all of that in a div. Like, that's how that stuff used to be done. And then when CSS 3 came along, which Jimmy's referring to, they said, you know what? Border radius, box shadow, a whole bunch of other stuff. Flex came along, and it will keep getting better. You know, there'll be better ways to do a lot of this stuff. There'll be ways to just refer to these common tropes and habits that you do all the time. And it's super exciting to kind of be part of that. And you can go and look, like CSS 4 new features. Go look at this maybe in a couple weeks. Once you've kind of gotten more comfortable with CSS. Otherwise, it just kind of looks like gibberish. Some interesting, a lot of stuff with selectors, it looks like. So, there you go, look at that. I literally did not even know this existed. That there was a not thing. That you could just say not P has a color blue. It makes sense, right? Like, that's much clearer than having to say, you know, you have a whole body over here, and then you go and override it somewhere else. So, lots of interesting stuff. this kind of gets us to our natural break point, and then we'll talk about assignment 1 after. I could talk hours for web page. We could go and do all of this together. I would love to. I'm having a lot of fun with you and everyone who's here. But again, there's a lot of stuff to watch in this course, and I'm just hoping that we've covered enough to maybe give you a bit of like, oh, I kind of see how I'd start. The tutes do this anyway. You've got great tutors. Are there any other kind of questions or things people are like, I still really don't get X? Because I just want to know whether we'll wrap up the lecture or whether we'll take a break and do another 5 or 10 minutes before we talk about assignment 1. So if you do have anything like that, please share it in the next, type it in the next 30 seconds, and I'll give everyone a minute just to get that through. But once you've watched the CSS mobile and the frameworks and grids and DevTools lecture, you kind of don't need anything else, to be perfectly honest with you. That's pretty much all the CSS. One thing I would say, and I probably should take this out, to be honest, is the grids lecture is not that profound. It's actually kind of more a demo, and everything, grids is really just a simplified version of Flex in a way. The API is very different. I don't think there's anything in your assignments that you would use grid for, so if you're short on time, you could just honestly skip that one and just never watch it until you feel like you need a grid. But most of it's pretty straightforward. Reese has asked the question, have we covered media queries, or do we cover media queries? This is all the stuff in the mobile CSS lecture. I will very quickly touch on it just to motivate you what this is about. But basically, there's... Where's my page? There's a thing that CSS is able to do where you're able to apply a particular property in a particular condition. So you can see here that I've got my body as that font family. What if I want to give my body a yellow background? Okay. Now what happens if I want to give my body a pink background, but only when it's small? Only when the width is really small. I can go and write a media query like this that says, you know what? When the width is less than 600 pixels, I want you to apply these styles instead. Like this. Oops, sorry, wrong way around. Max width, sorry. Max width 600. So now when the browser gets smaller, it's just going to go pink, like that. Pink, yellow, pink, yellow, pink, yellow. Lots of fun. And the CSS mobile lecture touches on that. And for your third question of the assignment, which some of you might not have looked at, that is actually kind of a handy way to solve a problem. But that's kind of honestly like a lot of mobile, when we talk about, mobile responsiveness, it's honestly just like one of two things. It's either these media queries, which are covered in the CSS media lecture this week, or it's just smart usages of flex and percentage widths. And you can kind of see that on pages like this one here, where a lot of this is just web elements that scale and they get a bit smaller, and then that's a media query. That's jumping to totally different elements on the website probably, or hiding or doing whatever. You can kind of think of media queries as the opportunity to use completely different CSS with the same HTML. That's really what they are. And just an important thing, the order does matter. If you define the body like this after, the body will always override it and it will never get smaller. Because it's like CSS is still imperative in that way. It will allow a second definition, but it will override the previous definition. That was something I battled with for 3 hours yesterday when trying to do something. Mitchell says, is background just for convenience for background color? Yeah, so that's a great question. There are a few helpful tags like background, margin, padding, border, which are essentially composite tags, properties, which are essentially composite properties made from other properties. So like border, when I say something like border 1 pixel that's actually the equivalent of me just saying border size, border width. Border width is 1 pixel. Oh, I don't know if I've got these properties right. Border style and then border color. That's just like a condensed way of writing it. The same is true for background and padding. In fact, many of these, sometimes with background, when I say red, the background property actually has a really specific, what what would you put it? Like, it has a really specific ordering that things need to be in. And I'm not sure if this is spelled out on W3 very well. But I think it's in this order. Basically, you have to define things in this order. It's actually taking in a bunch of stuff here. And if you don't define them in this order, then... Yeah, all the composite properties essentially just have an order to them. So you can't just like shove random elements in. But they're all kind of nullable. You can skip some, right? As in you can just say background 10 pixels and it will figure that out for you. So that was Mitchell's question. And then the last question, then we'll wrap this up and take a break. William says, part 2 of the assignment mentions responsive static page. Is that where we're supposed to use things like width 100% and max width? Yeah, let me talk through that in the next lecture about assignment 1. So let's wrap this one up. Hope this has been a fun demo. Let's take a 8-minute break. 5 seems too short. 10 seems unnecessarily long for the evening. Yeah, great. Thank you.